Hello, Dr. Dave Webster. This is part of my ongoing video blog series about PET in Ontario, and you may remember if you've seen my last video, it was entitled Yet Another Breast Cancer Victim Seen as a Success Story by Ontario's Politicians and their Medical Experts. I ended that video by raising this issue. I said it was time to ask crucial questions of those who are responsible for treating all of Ontario's cancer patients. And I said this, I said, do you really think that the patient I described in that video, that her oncologists were not aware of the critical roles for PET-CT outside of Ontario? So I'm about to do a short series of videos, and I'm going to now ask what I think is my most critical question that I've asked to date, and that is, where do Ontario's oncologists' loyalties lie? Is it with their patients, which is what you would hope to be the case, or is it with Cancer Care Ontario? And what you need to keep in mind is that Ontario's oncologists are the only physicians in Ontario who are paid by Cancer Care Ontario. Now, I've made some statements on my social media site that have been very upsetting to Cancer Care Ontario, and it turns out are oncologists. And I want to give you a bit of background so that you can begin to understand why I might make these statements and whether or not you agree. Now, one of the statements I've made is that if you have cancer, you should leave Ontario immediately. But this is not really practical for most patients. So I've also said Ontario physicians need to protect our patients from Cancer Care Ontario. Now, it turns out I'm not the first group or person or group to say this. In fact, in 2006, a prominent Canadian cancer advocacy group said, in a backhanded way, if you do not want access to modern investigations of your cancers, i.e. PET, or to treatments, you should move to Ontario. Now, since 2005, Canadian and international medical experts have condemned the Ontario government and Cco physicians in absolutely unprecedented ways, and they've done so in their major medical journals. Some of the things that they've said is the capricious use of a scientifically baseless process to block Ontario patients from access to PET. In 2005, the Cancer Care Ontario's experiments on cancer patients were officially declared unethical, and then in 2009, Dr. Eldridge, who was the most senior member of the PET Steering Committee, would resign publicly and make the astounding statement, quote, what those who are blocking PET are doing borders on immoral, end of quotes. Having seen this and other information, you may decide that the statements I made are not only rational and logical, but possibly I have not gone far enough in my statements. But what clearly this leads to is a very unsettling question. Why are these profoundly disturbing accusations of absolutely no concern to Ontario's oncologists? And what you will also realize is that just like Cancer Care Ontario has been doing for the last couple of years, we're now seeing Ontario oncologists who are threatening physicians who would dare ask them to defend their investigation and management of their cancer patients. Something else I want you to contemplate is that, do you really think that the massive and expensive infrastructure of the Ontario Ministry of Health, Cancer Care Ontario, McMaster University, and other government-funded organizations is just to block patients from PET, the accepted world standard of imaging management of cancer and other diseases for almost 20 years? Obviously not. PET is just a very good example of how critical healthcare policies affecting you and your family have been made in Ontario and made for a very long time. Turns out it's a very simple two-step process. The first step is that the Ontario politicians, their senior bureaucrats, and in this case their medical advisors, sit down and decide what the government should cover under OHIP. You will also realize that a major factor in these policies will be ensuring that the income expectations of politically powerful medical specialty groups is maintained. The second step in this process is that then Cancer Care Ontario and McMaster medical experts set about manufacturing quite literally the quotes, quality evidence, end of quotes, to justify the policies they've already made. And at this point in time, no one is disputing the statement that these decisions are not based on the accepted methods of science and peer-reviewed literature, but as best put by Professor Rodney Hicks from Australia, they are based on an egregious political agenda. And that agenda is directed squarely at our patients. Now, as you watch my statements on social media and posts and so on, I want you to get an idea of where I'm getting this information and why I'm claiming it to be factually true. Well, back in 2004, I was the president of the Ontario Association of Nuclear Medicine. It was at that time that we made numerous attempts to try and get the government and the medical experts to defend how they were assessing PET. And to this day, they have refused to answer a single question. But one of the things that we did do was hire Mr. Michael McCarthy. And it turns out that before we hired him, he had been the senior assistant to Mr. Tony Clement, who was the Ontario Ministry of Health back in 2001. And it was at that time that critical decisions were made that last to this day about what was to be done about PET in Ontario. So what they did do, Mr. McCarthy attended all these meetings, was they met with Cancer Care Ontario, and at that time Cancer Care Ontario was given its mandate to literally discredit, delay, and block PET, and simply because the government didn't want to pay for PET. A second very key document is, particularly if you're thinking of suing the Ontario government, comes from Triumph out of the University of British Columbia. This is Canada's preeminent center in the physics behind things like PET scanning and what we do in nuclear medicine. But they would hire a freelance journalist named Miss Susan Martinuck, and she would produce a very powerful and extensive document entitled The Use of Positron Emission Tomography PET for Cancer Care Across Canada, Time for a National Strategy, published in 2011. And I think you'll find this a very factual summary of Ontario's efforts to block PET. But also keep in mind the statement in 2017 of the Auditor General. Ontario patients have the least number of PET scans per 1,000 population of any medical jurisdiction offering PET in the world. And what is particularly disturbing is that the politicians, bureaucrats, and medical experts, I assure you, are all very proud of this dubious effort. Now, if you'd like to see some examples of the devastating impact I see because of their decisions, and I see this on a daily basis, I would invite you to go to my YouTube video channel and look at some case examples. This is my website and my various social media sites. Now, in my next video in this series, it's going to be entitled A Brief Overview of Cancer Care Ontario's Efforts to Take Ontario's Patients to literally last place amongst advanced medical jurisdictions. Thanks for listening.